All right. Well, happy Tuesday, everybody, and welcome back to another Future Focused, where we are continuing to live at the intersection of business technology and human experience. I say this every week, but I truly am looking forward to this conversation because we're digging into behavioral science. And I'm joined by Nick Hobson, who's the managing director of North America for Influence at Work, who he's got a PhD at the end of his name, which is far fancier than what I've got at the end of mine. But we're going to be digging into the behavioral science side of this, and not just from an academic perspective of, in theory, how does this stuff work? But similar to me, he's got a very deep passion for how do we actually translate what we know about human psychology and human behavior into what we see at work, and also at this really unique inflection point we're at in the digital age right now with the rapid acceleration of Gen AI. So we're going to be digging into a whole bunch of different topics. And one of the things we were talking about backstage that will be fun to dig into is, why do we keep making the same mistakes and not learning from the ones of the past? And what can we do about that as we prepare for the future? So Nick, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. And yeah, I can't wait to talk about everything and probably solve the world's problems.
We're going to solve it. We're going to fix it all. That's the thing. Anybody watching, all the problems will be fixed in the next hour. So make sure you're taking notes, or if you have not subscribed to my Substack, subscribe to my Substack, because that's where you'll get the condensed version of it. But you're going to want to listen to the whole thing. So don't alt tab. Let's just say that. So for those who don't know you, Nick, I'm really curious, even digging in myself a little bit more into this. What is your background? Because one of the things we were talking about backstage is you originally went down this path in the academic sphere, and now you're playing in the business sphere. So what was that? Were you always planning on doing behavioral science, even back to your childhood youth?
No, that's a good question. Yeah. So before we solve the world's problems, we'll solve my own as a little therapy.
Yeah. This will be a little therapy session that sets us up for solving the rest of the world's problems.
So I'll try to be as brief as possible, but it is sort of an important setup and context to the work I do today. I actually wanted to be a real doctor, a medical doctor, although I am Dr. Nick Hobson.
I like that you say a real doctor. I don't think I've ever heard a PhD refer to like an MD as like actually downplay the real doctor. That's hilarious.
Well, and I'm going to go on tangents. I think this is our style, so it's all good.
That's fine. Yeah, it is.
My wife and I were watching it. I think it's called American Fiction. It's this new movie that came out. It was up for all sorts of awards, and we only finished half of it because that's typically what we do. We get too tired to finish a movie. But the main character is a PhD in literature.
Okay.
And then his siblings are all physicians, plastic surgeon, cardiologist, or something like that. And his book editor, because he's an author, was making fun of him, like, "Oh, and how are you gonna? What kind of doctor are you? Are you gonna revive your sentence or your phrase or something like that?" So I laughed at that joke because that's very much me. We should have a different.
I appreciate the humility of it, though. Honestly, I used to work with someone who had a PhD in sales. And he literally went around literally went around asking people to refer to him as doctor. I won't mention the name, but I remember you would just literally almost feel the eyes roll in the back of people's heads. And they're like, really? Like, you really want us to call you doctor, whatever? It was pretty entertaining.
Well, it's funny. Well, I'm sure we'll get to this. So maybe just to kind of dangle it, like for the audience or anyone listening, is that there's certain things that we can do to send cues across, like in a social environment, which signal authority. So a lot of our client work today talks about like how you can use authority in the right way to get somebody else to say yes to your appeal or your request. And authority is a really big one. But to your point there, like it's often not only abused but misused, and there's a backfire where you're like, whoa, like, why are you asking to be called doctor? That seems like I'm skeptical now, or I'm questioning your intent. And
I could just tell you from experience in that example, did not have the intended effect. Right. I think that this gentleman was going for. People weren't going, wow, now let me listen up, doctor.
And to make it even worse is they don't even have this self-awareness to know that that's the effect that's having on the other party, because they're probably just so here inside their own little head. Back to a doctor.
Yeah, so you were going to be a real doctor.
Yeah.
And then you went the academic route.
First year undergrad, there was kind of like at most big university institutions, there's like the compulsory required intro psych course, which like every student has to take no matter what department
No
school.
matter what you do.
So I took that and I fell in love.
Okay.
I like, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. And I changed, what was it? Majors, I guess. I changed degrees. So I switched from pre-med health medicine to
Okay.
psychology, neuroscience. And it was at that point that I was like, okay, I want to do the academic thing. I want to do the research and the science thing. So after undergrad, went to master's and PhD at the University of Toronto, where I studied social personality psychology. And my focus, because when you get a PhD, it's very, you get very specific in your
Yeah.
like stupidly specific. And I studied ritual, emotions, the use of emotions and decision making. But really,
Okay.
my PhD at the end of it was the psychology and neuroscience of rituals, which I still do some interesting client work on as well.
Interesting.
And it was about halfway through, but it was always, I wanted to be the professor, like the patch wearing professor.
Okay.
The university, have my own lab, do my own research, et cetera, et cetera. And then life had other plans. I was with my wife, and she had started her career as an educator. And if you're an academic and you really want to commit to being an academic, your first job, or even your first couple jobs, no matter how good you are, even if you're like a star in your field, you have to be willing to move anywhere. And so when you go on the job market, as they say, you cast this very wide net, and then just hope to God that you get a bite, and that's where you're moving, like Arkansas, or I don't know, like pick some
doesn't matter. Yeah, it's wherever
US.
they say, hey, we'll take you.
We have an opening at the right time that you applied, so you go. Anyway, so long story short, we weren't willing to move we're in Toronto, the Toronto area, and family, friends, her career. And so I was like, all right, well now I did some very quick math, which is like, there's X number of schools in this like catchment area, and there's going to be X number of positions open at the moment that I'm on the job market. The likelihood of me getting getting a job at one of these Toronto region schools, institutions, is next to nothing. So it was pivot time. And I had no idea, because that was my identity. And oddly enough, even if you study identity, when it comes time to like figure it out for yourself, you're absolutely clueless and full of all anxiety and panic that any normal human would have. So there was a bit of a freak out moment of like, what am I going to do? Who am I? Kind of questioning.
Yeah, the existential identity crisis of everything I thought I was planning is now up in the air.
Yeah. And then there's this kind of like void. There's this like great unknown. And at the time, I literally didn't know, because I had been planning for just this one small like role for myself. So after the panic had subsided, I went to some friends, and it seemed like strategy consulting was like the next good stop for an anxious, decently smart overachiever like myself. So you move from PhD academia to like Big Four consulting. So think like McKinsey, Deloitte.
Hey, you had better aspirations. You had better, more aggressive aspirations than I did. When I had my early career existential identity crisis, I just picked up, I'm like, I don't know what I want to do. So I guess I'm just going to pick up a sales rep position, because I have no idea what else I'm going to do.
Well, I was the same, like, but they do it. This industry does a really good job. I mean, this is actually a fascinating side point. Like, they do a really good job and have poured however many millions and millions of dollars over the last 2-3 decades in their talent strategy, because typically McKinsey, Bain, BCG, and then your Big Four, Deloitte, PwC, KPMG, and EY. So there's like the 7 really big firms. They typically would have hired MBAs, and your MBA becomes a senior strategist, and then 2 years up or out, you kind of make your way eventually to partner, or you're out and you go into a more chill client side, more relaxed, better work-life balance job. But those consulting gigs they pay really well. They pay above market. They are exciting because you get to travel. You're usually a young person without a family at that point. So you
no other commitments
all the time. Like, you work like 12-hour days. It's insane. And then they realized, and I don't know when or how or who realized, probably about 10 years ago, as I was writing my PhD, that they're like, hey, we've been hiring these smart MBA students. There is this other talent pool over here of PhDs. And I don't care what PhD they're in. I don't care if they're in bio, engineering, psychology, literature, philosophy. I met all these PhDs in McKinsey. It doesn't matter. They're like, you have a PhD, you have your brain and mind works a certain way. Let's go after them. So then they came up with a dedicated strategy to attract talent from academics like myself who were looking to leave the field of academia.
You know, they haven't picked up, they clearly have not picked up on middle school computer and math teachers. That apparently did not land on their trajectory of, you know what, that's a category. So maybe that's where I went wrong.
And you're better off for it, because let me tell you, the next part of my story is, once I finished my PhD, I interviewed at these places and went to KPMG, kind of like people and change consulting. So strategy meets HR. And I lasted all of 3 months because I hated every second of it, and realized that I'm not the corporate type, and I just don't fit into their games and politicking that they want to play. And that was another moment. You know, I had the moment 3 or 4 years previous.
Yeah,
that's,
like,
what am I
that's
gonna do?
two very quick identity crises.
Exactly. Yeah. But this one was much better because I was like, whoa, I know I don't want to be
I
this.
hate
And
this.
exactly. And that was like, it was actually kind of really difficult because my wife was pregnant with our first. I had just finished 10 years of education. I'm like a grown man expecting a family now. We're about to move to our first home that we bought. And I was like, oh, I have my first, we used to joke, big boy job. And I last 3 months, and I'm like, hey babe, I'm quitting. so that was, but oddly enough, despite that kind of unknown and the scariness of that, on the other side, the clarity was reassuring, because I looked at, say, managers or senior managers or even partners in the firm of this big Toronto KPMG office. And I looked to them and I saw them and I saw their behaviors and I saw their lives. And I said, I don't want that. I don't want your life. There's nothing about your life that I want. And if that's the trajectory, like if that's where that's like, you basically look at that person and you go, okay, that could be me in 5 to 10 years. Well, I don't want that. So then your decision, it's quite clear and easy.
It makes it that much
easy
easier
to make.
Yeah.
So then from there, I went into business for myself, and I mean, I'm a psychologist / behavioral scientist, and it's basically the same thing. And there was this movement, if I can call it that, happening in around that between 2010 and 2015, where behavioral science, behavioral economics was kind of presenting itself in the market as a viable solution to various applications, whether it was government, policy, and it started there. And then it kind of came into marketing and sales. And then, you know, basically we're now at a point where it touches every aspect of either business or government, for profit, not for profit. And, you know, one of our greats passed away last week, which if somebody, you know, I think a lot of people know him, Daniel Kahneman, or Danny Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, among other works. Him and his colleague Amos Tversky in the 70s, in academia, in science, in basic research, were the first ones to talk about human biases in decision making and why we make certain decisions that we do that don't make perfect rational sense. And it stayed in academia for 70s, 80s, 90s, 30, 40 years. And then in 2008, 2009, Danny wrote his book, and 2 other books came out, Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational and Nudge, Thaler and Sunstein's Nudge. So those 3 books came out within like a year of each other. And it kind of opened the floodgates to people like me, behavioral scientists, psychologists, bringing our work into the real world. And so I credit whatever success I have today, I do credit to just opportune timing and good timing. There was like, here's a parade. I'm going to jump in front of it. I'm going to jump out of the KPMG parade.
Well, the window was there though, because to your point, in that time frame, and I think there's continued to be positive movement in this direction, this recognition that actually understanding your workforce and the employees that are in it and the way people think, the way people operate, is actually, they're not just cogs in a machine that you just plop in and plop out and move around, but it's been a slow journey. That's been my observation, is that it's not necessarily this like, oh yeah, we get it now, and we now have adapted our businesses to accommodate to some of that stuff. It's we still got a lot of work to do.
A lot of work. And as far as behavioral science goes, it's interesting that that function, or that, I'm not sure whatever to call it, like the internal facing side of organizations, so let's just call it people in HR, is
Yep.
actually the very last part for where behavioral science is touching. It was, as I said, government. So how can we improve citizens lives and affect policy and legislation? And then it went to, it certainly found its place in like marketing, sales, and customer experience. So for some reason, behavioral scientists or the people who were paying for behavioral science services were like, oh, I can see this use case as applied to customers or to brand strategy, or journey mapping, or whatever the case may be. Meanwhile, the employee experience was overlooked and ignored for the last 10 years.
Yeah. And what's interesting about it is it doesn't necessarily surprise me understanding the inner workings of a lot of corporate structures, in that, while HR is often branded as the people function, it is a very operational and tactical function for a lot of organizations. There's a lot of tactical activities like, hey, how do people get their paychecks? And how do we make sure we have benefits in place? And so there's a lot of box checking and task operation stuff. Oh, there's been a complaint, we need to check it out. We need to do these kinds of things. So it can be a little misleading for a lot of organizations where they see, oh, HR is the people organization, but not even necessarily a lot of HR organizations are truly what I would say human-centered in terms of how they work. They're much more like, well, there's human tasks that need to get done, and we are the task makers of that.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. You're completely right, and I think there's probably I'm a scientist, so I'm always thinking about what is the kind of causality of that, like what conditions were in place to lead to this that we're seeing at this very moment. So what hypotheses would we say is the case? Well, I think one is HR. Well, you kind of said this. It's very like operationally focused and like you check this box, you pay this person, like sort of like HR ops and HR risk stuff. So info and security stuff with people in an organization. But this kind of is like such a truism. But shouldn't the people function be the most human centric in an organization because it's people? And I think that's where we're at this point. And I think it harkens back to, if we kind of reverse it into history, it harkens back to like the Industrial Revolution. And in the Industrial Revolution, when we were producing widgets, and there's this guy named Taylorism, which some people might have heard, in the early 20th century, when Industrial Revolution was really at its peak, he realized that, well, we could get more out of these people and produce more, and therefore be more profitable as a it was just basic kind of business sense. And so he had this thinking of, well, how could we do that? We put this person in this position on the assembly line, and we have him or her work for a certain period of time. And he basically was trying to optimize them. But the way he was thinking about it was they were machines, or they weren't humans. They're not humans. They're devoid of emotion. They're devoid of motivation or values. No, they're just there to produce a widget. And that type of, there's still vestiges of that thinking that have carried over 150 years to today, despite there being ridiculously huge, rapid advancements in technology, where we're not in the Industrial Revolution.
And even the way work happens. I mean, I think about just my observations on just workforce changes. I mean, when you think about work as it used to be, jobs used to be much more robotic in terms of like, you just needed to do a thing. And there almost was this general acceptance that I know that's what work is. So there was this bifurcation of your identity of like, I go to work to do this thing, but my life is over here. Like I just work to live, and I do a thing and it provides me what I need. And then as a result, I actually live my real life over here. And so I don't think it was optimal, but it kind of worked a little bit more. But work has changed so much that thinking that way of operating, it's like trying to jam a square peg into a round hole, and you're like, well, it is never going to go through.
Yeah. And what's interesting is there's a book behind me that's called Work by James Sussman, and he's an academic, but more on like the anthropology and archaeology side. And he and his colleagues have evidence and have argued for many years that what you've just described there, or what we just described there as like, let's call it industrial revolution era of working or
Yep.
labor, is a blip in the grand scale of human evolution. So let's go back 100 years before the industrial revolution. Let's go back 500, 1,000, 10,000 years to all the way back to when, you know, we became Homo sapiens and sort of the advent of our species. We worked there. Yes, there was labor. That's part of our cultural and part of our biological evolution. So work is part of us. And that's why we have such a deep yearning to work and to exert effort. Freud talked about it like there's two urges, I think, like to have sex and to work, basically something like that. But he was nuts and high on coke, but he was absolutely correct in that sense, that we have this deep urge to work. And as Sussman has argued in his book and his work, for 99% of our existence as human species, we did the type of work that was good for us or natural as part of our advancement and evolution, which they found is actually, if you go back 20,000, 50,000 years to sort of like more nomadic hunter-gatherer style, our ancestral type living, we quote unquote worked about 20 to 25 hours a week. And the rest was leisure. The rest was dining together, breaking bread together in with our tribes, our fellow tribes people. It was with family. It was celebrating. It was engaging in ritual. And the other was 20. So this idea of like, we're becoming more advanced as a society and we have better productivity, and yet we're working far more than we did for the vast majority of our existence as a species.
Well, and even what you just described there, and I saw this as just a huge fracturing that happened in COVID, which was an absolute fascinating thought experiment to watch, in that going back to this desire that people have to be in community with others, and like you said, break bread, to do these things, and hadn't realized how much we'd started to intermingle and intertwist the work, the professional world with our personal world. And then when it got fractured, it just, again, going back to these identity crises where people went, wait a minute, like my whole world fell apart. And you're like, your whole world fell apart. You just had to work from home. Like, why was this? And you're like, oh, because your whole community and everything that you built around you, you probably actually were only still working the 20, 25, 30 hours, but that community element had been integrated into your work life, and you suddenly had it fractured at a level that you were not expecting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're now seeing record numbers of levels of isolation and loneliness. And for a lot of people, it was and still continues to be, and my argument is that work ought to be a form of connection, because it's in us. It's I don't like this phrase, but it's in our DNA, which means like we've evolved to work. And in particular, we've evolved to work with others. It's a high dopamine activity to collaborate and to create with other people, because that's how we survived as a species. And so,
which
when
it's
COVID
interesting you say that, because this is where it's interesting you talk about this, because this is where I see this around culture, where there is this desire where people want to connect the dots. And sometimes companies, because it gets messy, can kind of go, well, this is work, so that's your personal life. And it's like, well, but you can't really do that, because like you said, we have this desire that's built into us to find purpose in our work. And so to just say, no, leave that at work, leave the rest of that at home. It's like, you can't do that. A person cannot divorce that in their identity.
No. And any business or company, even the most successful, like I think of big tech, any company that thinks they can do that, and my mind goes to like all the mass layoffs and sort of like the hyper surveillance. So it's like, you're here to work, I give you a wage and you produce, it really goes back to what we were just saying. You're now just producing widgets, but it's impossible to track or to enforce from management point of view or leadership point of view, because you can't point to and say, yes, you've produced 10 widgets as you were supposed to, good job. No, what are we producing now? We're producing ideas. and you can't measure those or operationalize those in the same way. So there's some companies and I'm like, oh God, you guys are absolutely, bastardizing this, and you fail to recognize the basics of human psychology and human behavior. It's like they need to have teams of behavioral scientists in there to remind senior leadership. But then I'm also optimistic, and it's heartwarming to hear of certain, companies, even some big brands and big organizations who see that, who go,
yes,
you know what? And that's where we're starting to hear things about like autonomy and flex work and the 4-day work week and unlimited PTO and all of these new policies and processes on the people in HR side, that they all might look differently, but in their very essence, I think they can be boiled down to certain things, which are, we humans we are motivated by 3 basic core desires or needs. It's called self-determination theory, which is backed by decades of research. And that is autonomy. So we like to just have a sense of freedom, which a lot of organizations really mess that up because they're enforcing, and they're, now you have to be compliant. So that's just like, you don't want that. So autonomy, competence. So we like to be good at something. We like to exert effort and say, look, I did that. I built that.
Yeah.
And then 3 is relatedness. So I like, you like to have autonomy, you like to build stuff. And as I said earlier, you like to do that with other people. If organizations and leaders can provide those 3 things, can meet those 3 needs for their people, you'll be happier. You'll be more engaged. And if you really want an economics argument and a financial or a fiscal argument, more engaged employees are more productive.
Produce better.
So there you go. Win-win.
That's the funny part about this, is a lot of times I do run into situations where organizations are wrestling with this. Well, do we focus on improving our performance, or do we focus on taking care of our people?
Mm-hmm.
And I always look at it and go, why do you see this as 2 separate activities? If you're doing the one, the second will naturally come out of it, because you do hear sometimes this, and again, this move to compliance. I think especially when companies moved into this new environment where, to your point, I feel like there was a false sense of, oh, we know that they're being productive because we can see them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, that didn't really tell you, because to your point, it's like, well, what are you measuring productivity in? It's this very vague thing that you haven't really identified. So you feel more comfortable because you see something tangible. So you go, well, I'm more comfortable with it. All of a sudden that was taken away. Yeah. And there was this fear, and I still see this flare up a lot, of like, well, but if we're not observing it, people are just going to go watch Netflix and hang out at the beach. And to your point of kind of the ethos of human behavior, no, people have a desire to work and produce and to create a quality like that's naturally built in.
It is.
And so this fear that, oh, well, people are just going to go do nothing if we don't force compliance, actually is counterintuitive to the science.
Exactly. And it will not only will it not work, it'll have a backfire effect. Because if I know I'm being watched, or that there's this expectation that I'm compliant, what is that? That's a violation of my autonomy. And I will engage in what's called reactance. And reactance motivation is, you can't tell me what to do. It happens. We do it all the time because it's like, no, F you, even if it's your boss, F you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the absolute bare minimum now, or I'm going to quit. And then that's going to be a cost on the organization for premature exit or tenure, attrition. And then you'll bear the cost of that as an organization, because then you have to go and recruit and you have to go and interview. So I think what organizations start to realize is just give people the freedom to do good work, and they will do good work because it's within us to want to do that. But if you come across and you start to, like, I hear some horror stories of just the level of surveillance, of like, are they tracking your mouse movement or things like that? Like, as soon as somebody finds out that that's happening, you've lost them. You've lost that person.
Well, and what's funny is, going back to the people want to do good work, stories like that, I've actually been fascinated by the efforts and energy and creativity and innovation people will go to work around that compliance metric. Like you'll have
yeah,
people
yeah, yeah.
engineering, and you're like,
Exactly.
imagine if they invested that energy and innovation into their actual job
Yeah.
instead of going, oh,
Yeah.
really? You're going to track my webcam and my mouse clicks? You know what? I'm going to go in my garage and design a machine that sits at my chair on a green screen. Like, and you're like, wait, what is your job again? Like, you don't do any of these things,
Yeah,
but you
yeah.
self-taught yourself. You self-taught yourself this all to get around this compliance thing. Because to your point, it is this like, wait a minute. And I've got 7 kids, so I see it all the time. You tell your kids, don't do that. Like, or what? It is a 100% guaranteed way to make sure that they are going to want to see how far they can push that boundary.
Yeah, and I have a toddler. You do too. Like, there's nowhere clear that you see the need, the deep desire to exercise one's freedom and autonomy than in a toddler who's having a tantrum, a meltdown. And as an annoying as it is for us parents, because we usually have to get somewhere or get them to eat or whatever the case may be, psychologically, if we can just pull ourselves back for a moment, you go, that is how it's a deep need within us to want to have that freedom. And that doesn't go away. I mean, we're better regulate ourselves as we age and mature, but it doesn't go away even in our organization and business life.
Well, and it's funny you say we get better at regulating, but it doesn't go away. And I think that's what a lot of times creates this false sense of, well, yes, we can do this because we're dealing with adults. And it's like, yeah, but the behavior is still there. They may have gotten better at hiding it. They may have gotten better at, masking it or putting it, where you don't see it. But that desire, that behavior is still intrinsically wired in. And, you may be driving it into the shadows, but you haven't actually corrected it.
No. Yeah. And just to touch on, because some people might be interested, there's a great book by Dan Pink who summarizes the research on motivation. And one of the seminal studies, which kind of was a breakthrough for the fields, was this distinction between intrinsic motivation or internal motivation and extrinsic or external motivation. And when it comes to adults in a workplace, well, what is the most obvious form of extrinsic motivation? It's pay. We're paid for our job. We have a salary. But that can only get you so far. So there's basically 2 ways you can think of this. You can be satisfied at work and enjoy your work, dare I say, love your work, and you can be dissatisfied. But those 2 things aren't on a spectrum or continuum. They're binary, they're separate variables, if you will. So if you extrinsic motivation variables like pay, those will help you to not hate your job. So you're right, but they will not.
Yeah, they'll get you to the point where you don't begrudgingly show up to work and go, I absolutely hate being here.
Exactly. But what it won't do is it won't help you love your job. What only helps you love your job? So now we're talking about the satisfaction variable, because you've taken care of the dissatisfaction. You don't hate your job. It's not hated. That's good. But the only way to get to satisfaction or to love is not extrinsic rewards. It's intrinsic. And that's where you bring the autonomy. That's where you bring the competence and the relatedness. That's where you have to start to pull in more of these psychological forces and behavioral forces of like, what is a person, like what makes us tick? And what makes us tick is we want to create, and we want to create with others. And so organizations and leaders have to think about that, and they have to strategize, and they have to optimize to include those factors, because what we hear, especially going back to what we were talking about, like the professional services, is like, just pay them a ton of money, or give them those bonuses, or and that'll be enough. No, it's not enough. That's enough for them to not hate their job, but it's not enough for them to love their job.
Well, and I think we saw a lot of that. We saw a lot of that happening, especially as the pandemic was kind of going, and we had the big tech boom, where it was getting to this point where companies were just throwing money at candidates and going, well, this should work. We're like paying 2x market value on these jobs. So people are going to just love their job. They're going to be thrilled to be here. They're going to be loyal, all this other stuff. And then they were shocked when, like, on a dime, people would be like move, because they're like, well, yeah, I mean, it's fine, but I don't, to your point, I don't love it here. I'm satisfied, but I don't love it. And I'll go find that purpose in somewhere, thing somewhere else. And because the margins of pay just got so out of control, companies were shocked when people were like, yeah, I'll go make less money for purpose, because it's like, well, actually, I hit that threshold of I don't hate my job a
Exactly.
while ago.
Yeah.
Type
But
of a
there's
thing.
but there's still a void. I'm still looking for
Right.
something else to love my job, to love my work. And that's where you use the word purpose and meaning, and these things that we yearn for. We're not going to get that with making more money. So what I forgot to mention is this sort of seminal famous study with kids, where they had just sort of quickly summarizing it. I believe they had kids produce something like make a drawing, draw a piece of work or a piece of art. We're talking like kindergartners here. And in one condition, they rewarded the kid with stickers, which is basically like our money, you know.
Yep.
It's an
extrinsic. Oh, yeah.
It's an extrinsic.
I know
reward.
It could have been like Easter candy or something like that.
Yeah.
Same
Actually,
thing.
chocolate would work just as good. But you know, those extrinsically rewarding objects or things. And then in the other treatment condition, they didn't reward them with stickers or whatever it was. They rewarded them just with praise. So they said, basically reinforcing those intrinsic values, those internalized reward systems. And the children felt better and continued to do more of that art or that job, if you want to call it that, if they were given those intrinsic values. The ones who were given the extrinsic, the stickers, didn't persist at that work. They gave up sooner, essentially.
Okay.
So I mean, it's just like a perfect anecdote that you can apply into our real world. Stickers, money will get us so far. It's the intrinsic value of rewards for doing good work and doing good work with others that's going to allow us to persist.
Well, and what's interesting about that study, if you were to kind of like add it to like the adult level of, okay, so, to the two different children groups, the intrinsic and the extrinsic motivations, those folks who had the more sustainable intrinsic motivations, I think one of the challenges you run into as a company is you're actually balancing both, because adults, like, they're not just getting candy because they like candy, right? Like their pay is like, well, I have to support my family type of a thing. And so there are these thresholds where it's like, you can't ignore the extrinsic and go, oh, so if all we do is make them feel like they have autonomy and they're loved and they have purpose and blah, blah, blah. Because at some point they're going to go, yeah, that's great and all. And I've seen this in companies where they go, we don't have to pay very much because our purpose is just so grand and we do all these things. And it's like, that'll get you so far, and it might get you further than just throwing cash at the wall.
Yeah.
But at some point people will go, this is great.
Yeah.
But all it takes is something else that offers a similar purpose value, and they'll move like that.
That's true. That's a good point, and a good to kind of like push back a little bit, because it happened to me at my last company. I was there for 5 years. It was a very mission driven company, purpose, and it was known that if you worked there, you earned less. You were paid a below market value salary. It was just known, and everyone knew it. And this was actually most senior leadership in the company. This was what I call their second mountain. It's David Brooks' book, where like your first mountain is for you. You're going to go and make money. You're going to climb that corporate hierarchy. You're going to be the big boss and do whatever you want to do. And then that you get to your 40s, typically it's a bit of like midlife crisis, and you go, is this it? I got the paycheck. I got the managerial position. And they inevitably quit and go to another company that pays them way less, but affords them and provides them with that mission and that sense of purpose. So at this older company, this previous company I was at, that was all senior leadership from like McKinsey, BCG, Citibank, all the financial and professional services. This was their second mountain. But this was my first mountain because I was just younger in age. And for me, I was really motivated by the mission, by the purpose. But at some point, well, why? Because I had to move and I had a mortgage to pay. That was basically it, right? And so it wasn't, and this is where it gets, these extrinsic and intrinsic things are not like super clean cut. Like sometimes they can bleed into one another. So for me, and this is probably, I would hazard a guess and say this might be true for other people. Why am I earning a paycheck? Well, I'm earning a paycheck because I want to provide, you said it, I want to provide for my family. Now that it becomes that external reward becomes a proxy for supporting more an internal or intrinsic reward, which is my family. And you need that thing to reinforce or support the thing that you care deeply about, which in this case is family. So yes, we cannot ignore it, and we can't, it's at our peril that we just say, oh, well, we have a purpose and that's enough, because it's not.
Yeah. And I think that's the complexity behind some of this stuff that a lot of organizations are wrestling with. And I feel like, as we've come into this new age where there was a bit of a great awakening. And I think a lot of people moved to that second mountain when COVID hit. Like we saw this where there were a lot of people that had that moment of, man, I've been spending my whole career climbing this mountain, and I've kind of arrived at what I even originally thought the peak was. And now I'm here, and I don't really know that this is even the mountain I want to be on anymore, type of a thing.
Exactly.
How from your vantage point, because this can sometimes be, and I've been in lots of these conversations where you do feel senior, we talked about it backstage, where sometimes these things happen and there's this perception that, there's senior leaders in these dark conference rooms, like plotting, and it's like, that's usually not it. Usually it's senior leaders trying to do their best with this. How have you worked with leaders who are struggling with this? Because there can be this like, well, we can't just give people everything they want. And you're like, well, that's not what we're talking about here, that you just need to give people everything they want, or that you can have no accountability. You just need to let people run free. And if they want to go do whatever, then they'll do it. And actually, I found when companies go too far off that range, it actually backfires too, because people are like, I want to work, but I want to feel like what I'm working towards adds value. I don't just want to be off the res doing whatever. So how have you helped organizations navigate that? Because it gets complicated real quick.
Yeah, it does. And there's context matters a great deal too, because like industries are different, geographies are different, culture, like where you are in the world, the markets that you are running your business and staffing your teams, that differs. So that's just a disclaimer to say, like, whatever we say here is what we should do is, well, that will work in context A, but you can't replicate it in context B. Which, by the way, sort of side comment, that's why there should be scientists and psychologists on these teams, because like we're the ones to hopefully raise awareness and run tests and think about these things in a little bit more quantified type way. But to answer your question, I did quite a bit of work over the last few years, especially with my previous organization, coaching leaders on this mindset. You actually talked about it a few minutes ago, where it's this false dichotomy that's painted, where we say it's either people or it's performance. And if you engage in if you engage in productivity or performance, your people will be miserable, but you'll be profitable. Or if you try to appease your people and make them happy and productive and engaged, then inevitably you will suffer on the productivity point. That is a false dichotomy. It's not an either or. And what we came up with, a research-backed framework, was this notion of both and leadership, that you can be both people-focused or people-oriented and performance-driven. And what we found through our data collection was that for leaders and organizations that embodied that both and mindset, that people and performance, they were happier as leaders. They were less at risk of burnout. They were more engaged in their work. And so too were their teams and were their people. So you can achieve both. It's just a bit of a reframe, I think, of teaching, coaching, and getting senior leaders to think about it in a different way, that they can have the best of both worlds. But to your point, it also doesn't mean losing sight. Like, at the end of the day, you're a business, and you're a business in a marketplace, and you have to shareholder demands or whatever the case may be, and that's your fiduciary duty and responsibility, as well as the duty and responsibility to take care of your team. And it's this constant balancing act. So what we found is that I kind of portrayed it as an infinity loop, where you could almost toggle between the two poles of people and performance. And there may be seasons in the business, end of quarters, I don't know, like end of fiscal year, where it's going to be a sprint and you're going to be pushing your people, and there's going to be more accountability and people maybe working longer hours. But then you come out of that and you say, you know what, team, I know we've been pushing you. We're going to, I don't know, do something. We're going to give this week off. We're going to, whether it's an extrinsic reward or say promotion, or I'm going to give you this bonus, or if it's more intrinsic, say, over these next few weeks, we're going to prioritize care. We're going to prioritize self-care. And, and so now you've toggled, you've shifted out of the performance pole, and you've come to the people pole. And it's for leaders to stand back and have this sort of like balcony view and perspective on their business and their people to see like, yeah, where in this infinity loop are we? Where should we not be? And how do I pull the team out to get to the other side where we should be, which is, probably more productive and better for everyone.
It's so first of all, it's always encouraging when, people who have far more acronyms at the end of their name validate my observations in this, which is that this whole people or performance is a false dichotomy. Yeah. Yeah. And I do see that boil up a lot where people are like, well, which one do we choose? And it's not this one or the other, but to your point, it is this complexity of like, well, what do we really need right now? And I think that goes back to some of the pushback that sometimes come back of, well, so what? We just can't ever really focus. And it's like, yes, you can, but you have to recognize it's this delicate dance that you're doing all the time to actually meet the organization and your employees where they are. Because if you don't do it right, there will be fallout on both ends. Like you're going to lose in the performance end and you're going to lose in the people end. And that's the consequences of, if you just want to ignore it or just focus on one and go, I don't care, you're actually going to lose in both. So I think that's an interesting piece. Oh, go for it.
And we had some research on this, if I recall, it's a few years ago, where you can like leaders have their strengths and their own personalities and their own leadership styles and competencies, and we had a way to measure this within leaders. So let's say you are a leader and you are just by default, by your very personality, more performance oriented. And I, as a leader, am more people oriented, just for example, but we are both leaders on the same team. Maybe we're part of senior leadership. You have to think about because now if we're working together, my biases or default will pull you a little bit over to me and you'll be doing the exact same thing. And if we work well together, and this is a whole area of research on team dynamics and leadership dynamics of people working together, if we jive well, then I'll pull you to me on the people side when the time is needed, and vice versa. You'll do the same for me when the time is right to be more performance oriented. So not only is it a soul exercise of like, well, this is who I am. No, it gets super complex because now you're talking tens of senior leaders, dozens, and then all the way down to middle management. And then, in that typical corporate hierarchy, organizational hierarchy, it's like, how do you make the right teaming, staffing decisions so that you're putting the right people together who will either be similar when similarities need to exist and will be good, or to complement those, not just skills. Skills are one thing, and we've talked about those forever, but now how do we complement values orientation and personality and goals and emotional styles, how you respond to stress versus me, etc.
Well, and what's interesting about that isn't it interesting that another truth that comes out of this discussion is that diverse teams actually perform better because, again, instead of this groupthink of, oh, we've got everybody who thinks the one way and is just going this way, that if you actually have different frames of thought, different personalities, different perspectives in this, you're actually drawing each other to a more holistic center that actually has a better job of navigating some of these than if you just shove a whole bunch of people who think and act exactly the same way on a leadership team and try and drive an organization. It just does not work well.
And I'll say there, and the important caveat to diversity is often the next letter that we forget about in that acronym, which is I, the D&I, diversity and inclusion. So there's plenty of research now that shows if you just have a bunch of different people, so you've satisfied the diversity requirement, that's not enough. You don't see the positive outcomes or the benefits.
No.
You need people, you still need a sense of belongingness or inclusivity amongst those people. So here's this dance between we're different, yes, in whatever respects, but we're also the same on some level, and
our voices are equally valid. I guess, right? Is that a fair way of saying, like, our voices are equally valid and we're heard?
That yes, which kind of goes to like psychological safety, which is an important piece of it. I was thinking more in terms of we're marching to the same beat because we're striving towards the same outcome. It's a unified vision. Okay. Exactly.
Yep.
There's a great episode on Freakonomics on whaling in like the 1800s, or like, I don't know, whenever they whaled. This was a long time ago. And Stephen Dubner talks to I think it's a sociologist, I can't remember his name. And essentially they did this research where they looked at whaling ships and how these whaling ships were staffed. And they found that...
Wait, I was thinking like the ancient, because I grew up in a funeral home. So I'm thinking like ancient grieving, of like, you're talking literal whaling, like Moby Dick.
Oh yes, like, like killing whales. Yes, like Moby Dick, exactly. Which
Got
was sorry, I should have spelled it out. Yes, whaling on ships. And so they would staff these ships, and there were dozens of and it was very dangerous. It was high risk but high reward. And I'm pretty sure what this academic finds, and Stephen Dubner interviews him, is that the ships that had more diversity, just that, weren't any better. So they didn't have better, and they were able to track it with really cool outcomes, like the amount of whales that they killed or caught, which meant revenue, amount of dollars earned.
Yep.
They had to have, the ship had to have the right balance between diversity of the type of people on the ship who are working, and that unified vision that they were working together to achieve some sort of collective outcome as one. And that still holds true of, outside of the whaling business, into our knowledge economy work, where you need the I just as much as you need the D and I.
Well, and I think that goes back to something that's often skipped or overlooked, is there's this assumption that, well, we all work for the same company, so clearly we have the same vision and purpose. And it's like, oftentimes that's not super clear for people on what that vision and purpose is. And if you're missing that, to your point, you might have a lot of these other boxes ticked, but if everybody is not clear on what that vision purpose is, and people are just rowing in different directions, you're not necessarily going to see some of those benefits come to fruition.
Yeah. And there's a lot of fascinating stuff that we can draw on from, like, in my field of social psychology, in particular, of culture and ritual. And there's this cool term that they call superordinate identities. So it's called self-complexity. So we are multiple selves. We're parents, we're fathers, we're friends, we're sons, and we are employees, or we are, business owners or whatever. But we often, if you put all of your eggs in one identity basket, you risk feeling particularly bad when things go south in that one domain. So if I get fired and I just see myself as just like my professional self, I'm ruined, because I don't have.
I mean, you see that in athletes. You see that in athletes. That's a perfect example where you see that, where people have committed like their whole life, and then they blow out a knee or have a permanent injury, and you're like, that's it. I mean, their whole world just shatters.
Exactly. So there is great research on this notion of, it's called self-complexity. I love it. And it's a good reminder for me to make sure that I'm investing in those other versions or forms of myself, my identity, outside of just the professional one. And now I forget where I was going with this. What were you saying 30 seconds ago? Self-complexity, identities. I knew this was going to happen.
If there's not a unified vision and everybody's just rowing in all different directions.
That's right. Thank you. So superordinate identities is like, you imagine like a hierarchy. So you can have like the big one identity at the top, and then you can have multiple identities that sort of sit in a nested structure. So you and I will come, and we'll all come as like, we're a very big team. You'll have different little identities in your hierarchy, and I'll have different ones. But ultimately, the one at the very top is going to be our shared identity. That's going to be our superordinate identity. And that's the one that we're rowing, together for and towards. And even though you're different and we satisfy the diversity requirements, we share in that one superordinate identity or goal. Right. And that's what we're working towards. And that's important.
So we've only got a few minutes left, but this has been really interesting digging into some of these things. I'm curious, because there's a whole nother level I was going to go into in terms of kind of leadership and how we think about this. But for organizations who may be like stuck, because I get it right now, like organizations are dealing with a lot. Not only do they have the complexity of what's going on in the workforce, you've got this technological boom that's changing the way work happens. You've got a workforce that has been just messed with over the last few years. You've got an aging workforce that's on its way out. I mean, it's very tumultuous waters right now.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the key areas or things that you can go, what are some good steps people can take to get started? Because I think sometimes, and again, this probably just goes back to the psychology of it, you can almost just you get overwhelmed and you just don't even know where to start. That analysis paralysis of this just feels like too much to even handle.
It's a good question. I think the first step would be that level of self, like a moment of pause, like to take stock of not only like where your business is at or your team is at, but where you are at as an individual and as a leader. I think a lot of leaders lack in that situational and self-awareness, which means they usually struggle with things like empathy or compassion, or just like generally on the more people-oriented side of things. So I think there's a time of reflection that's needed right now for leaders and leadership. And at my previous organization, one of my favorite offerings that we had was, and they still have it now because they're still working as I'm gone, is what they call immersive experiences. Okay. And what they do is they take very, very senior level, C-suite execs, board members, and they pull them out of their environment. They pull them out of that that day-to-day context that they've been so used to and habituated to over the last years, decades. And they bring them into like the mountains or the desert or some sort of like kind of shocking surrounding. And they take all their digital devices, phones, tablets.
I've heard of these things.
And you go, and some of them are like not potential project, not my previous employer, but some of them are like even dabbling in like psychedelics and hallucinogenics, which is an actual thing within leadership development. Fascinating.
Yeah.
But whether there's a presence of psychedelics or not, I think the psychology is the same, or at least similar, which is pull you out of your environment, get you to think about things and ask yourself some serious questions that you don't normally have the time or the headspace, or because you're just running your business. You're doing what you do every day. So pull them out of a physical situation, put them into one that's really quite shocking, submerge them in ice baths, which is stuff they do, track their heart rate, track their biometrics, do a day of like a silence. So there's no talking. I've done these. They're quite profound is the word I guess I'll say. They're hard and but they're also very rewarding. And at the end of that 3, 4, 5 day experience, if it's worked as it's intended to, then that leader on the other side will see things radically different. Not only see their business and their teams, but also themselves. So not that I don't think every leader has to go on these shamanic style.
That's not the point. I think actually the point you're getting at, which I was involved with a big research report recently, and my add to this big report was the power of the pause. Mm-hmm. And what you're getting at is that I think is the wisdom that's in there is, and I think it's even harder today to fight against this tide right now, because everything is saying, go faster, do more. We gotta, like, everything is driving just this unrelenting drumbeat of we gotta go, 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 and nothing's ever fast enough. Exactly. And it is so hard to actually go, we're gonna fight against that and be intentional about saying no.
Yeah.
Our first step is we are going to completely step out of that.
Exactly.
And pause. And it fights against everything in you because you're like, but we're going to fall behind. Yeah. But what about this? And like all these other things are going to happen. And it's like, this path is the only path forward. And it's honestly one of the most counterintuitive things, especially in this day and age.
One of the frames we used to say is slowing down to speed up. And I think that like even small things like that help leaders go, you know what, you're right. And there's a great literature called paradoxical leadership. So you use the term there, which is perfect. It's a paradox. Paradoxical leadership is a great frame to think about what leadership is, and how to do it well. it really comes back to a lot of this like both and stuff. Like you can, because both and is weird. It's like, how can I exist in both states at the same time? It's like,
yeah, how can we slow down and speed up? And you're like, well, I don't know how to explain it to you.
A lot of it actually is rooted in kind of like Eastern mysticism and philosophy. So you're like Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, a lot of the Eastern religions, which are comfortable with dialectics, are comfortable with inherent contradiction. That's what the yin yang is. And almost every single Eastern myth or religion or philosophy has that like baked in. Whereas the Western religions and the Western philosophies, which let's not forget, we exist as a society today because of those theologies and philosophies. The Western versions are more like atomistic, which is like, this causes this, and it's very linear. Our religions are like that. Our philosophies are like that. So Socrates and Plato. Whereas in the East, it's more of this circular, contradictory, dialectic style, paradoxical style of thinking and behaving. And I think our world, just given the sheer complexity of what it is, especially with these technologies, I can't believe we didn't even talk about Gen AI. But like, as these
it's actually been kind of refreshing, to be honest with you. It's actually a little
true.
refreshing to have an hour-long conversation on human psychology and cognitive science and not get into the AI conversation. Because honestly, if you think about it, AI is only accelerating and exacerbating what's already in play. And if you miss this stuff that we talked about today, AI will just rip things to shreds. I think that's one of the biggest risks.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, we talked about this just before we went on air. I think this is why you need either people who like have a formal training like myself, or people like you who are just genuinely interested and passionate in like human psychology. We need us, and we need teams of us, either on clients, like on providing services to clients, or on internal teams, so that there's people at the table who are going, you know what, like, I know this thing about psychology and how humans think and feel and what motivates them. Maybe we should factor that in before we make some sort of executive.
Or I understand everything makes sense to run this way, but I think we should actually consider going the opposite. And here's why, even though it flies in the face of all our kind of emotional feelings right now, type of a thing. And I can say from experience, you won't always win that argument. Sometimes you'll get, the door slammed, and that's okay.
Yeah. And that's where we see improvement. And this is where I hope to go, where behavioral science goes, is not just what we do is we provide, like what I think I've maybe done here in our conversation is I go, and my friends always make fun of me because I always go, hey, did you know research shows, hey, did you know that research shows? That's like my one-liner. And they're like, shut up. Like, yeah, we know research shows something interesting or whatever. But that's only one half of like kind of the scientific, what I call the scientific mindset, is because what I'm doing is I'm or anyone who does what I'm doing here is we're drawing on, the wealth of literature that exists over the last century. And I go, oh, this study and this theory and this model, it shows XYZ. That's half of it. The other half is when you're in a business or in a government or in an organization, anything, and you go, look, I think it's going to be counterintuitive. You guys are leaning towards direction A, but the literature on psychology of motivation says it's probably going to go B. But the other half of it is, let's go and test it. Let's go and actually devise a set of hypotheses, form our predictions, and go get either some quant or qual data that can affirm, confirm, or not our testable prediction. And then you can, and what we do in our work is all the time is we pilot it with a smaller group, and you slowly sort of scale until you've landed at the right solution. So that the other half there is, and we're seeing more of it, is the testing and experimentation within organizations, which is a good thing, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. But again, even that requires you to slow down.
Exactly.
This, right? Because like, well, we don't have time for that. We just got to do it. And you're like, hey, whoa. Like, and again, to our earlier point, what you may not be realizing if you're a business leader listening to this is you may end up losing on both fronts.
Exactly.
By doing that.
Exactly.
You may lose, you likely will lose if you make mistakes here on both the performance and the people. And so it's not we're just going to lose here. It's like, no, you're going to lose the whole game.
Yeah. And I'm optimistic that because of this like wave of the last, let's call it 15, 20 years of more scientists, people scientists, behavioral scientists, psychologists, entering the workforce. Let's say I'm sort of at that wave 1, maybe wave 2. In 20 years' time, as we're the ones, if we've done our jobs well, to get into the really senior most positions in these organizations, hopefully we'll be making those decisions to say, look, experimentation is really important, and I'm going to mandate it because I'm now the CEO or whatever. Like, you know, I can make those decisions now. And I think that will be the case because I know this for a fact. I'd love to see some stats or data on this, but like, let's just say hypothetically, let's go 30 years ago. Let's count the number of PhDs in psychology, behavioral science, like social science, that kind of thing, in Fortune 500 companies. It'd be like next to nothing, I'd imagine. And now let's look at it today, and then let's forecast and look at what it's going to be in 20 years. I think there's just so much more of that talent in companies. There's more. So what does that mean? It means there's more people like myself who are bringing this to the
this
table,
perspective.
Exactly.
Which there's no better time for it to happen, especially with what we're going through, and what I think these next few years are going to bring. I think the trajectory we're on, it's encouraging, but it's much needed to avoid what I'm observing through my work and my studies, where I'm like, we got to be really careful because we're playing with some dangerous stuff right now. And I think the voice that we're bringing right now is critical. So Nick, I don't want to keep you any longer. I've already kept you longer than planned. And like you said, we didn't even scratch the AI front, which, like I said, was refreshing. So thank you so much. I'll definitely have to call you again, and we'll have you back, because this was a great discussion, and hopefully it's helped people just think differently or challenge some of the conventional wisdom that I think a lot of times drives things in a not productive environment, while also giving people some hope on what can you actually do. And what a simple yet difficult thing to say, which is stop. Stop.
Yeah. Exactly. But thank you for having me. Thanks, Chris. It's been great fun. I always like chatting about this stuff. So thank you for listening, and to those listening in as well.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for watching, listening, whatever you were doing. And we will see you again on the other side.